Welcome to the Powell-Liberty Historical Society September 2024 program. My name is Tom Coffey. I'm the Society Board President. Also, if you are not already a member, I invite you to become one. We do not charge for these presentations, but donations are greatly appreciated. Donations and membership dues help us maintain the Martin Perry House. If you have never visited the Martin Perry House, we invite you to do so. Please contact us first to ensure someone will be there. Our speaker this evening is Steve Schenck. Steve was raised 1 mile east of Powell Road, or east of Powell, off Powell Road, on the crest of the Powell Hill overlooking the Olentangy River. He attended the Powell School through 6th grade and graduated from Olentangy School on Shanahan Road in 1969. He received a BA degree in Business Administration from Hillsdale College in 1973. Soon after graduation, his interest in Ohio's prehistory and archaeological became a fascination and a serious avocation. In 1977, he became a member of the Archaeological Society of Ohio and attended their shows, lectures, and symposiums. He has served on the committees of the ASO, and in 2020, he was elected their board of directors and currently serves as treasurer. He is also a volunteer on the Delaware County Historical Society, where he curates their prehistoric Ohio Indian donations. Steve lives in Liberty Township with his wife, Mary, of 48 years, who is also a volunteer with PLHS. They have 2 sons, William and Daniel. And with that, Steve.
Okay. Thank you, Tom, and thank you to the Powell-Liberty Historical Society for giving me the opportunity to speak to you tonight. I want to make a few things clear right from the start. I am not a professional archaeologist. But for the last 47 years, Ohio's prehistoric history has become my avocation. I am a self-taught student of Ohio archaeology. I've been a field walker. I am an active collector and researcher. Basically, archaeology is fun for me. I also need to clarify that much of what we're going to talk about tonight is not necessarily fact or factual, but rather based on conclusions, based on that form theories. There may be our best guesses. As Brad Lepper once put, maybe our best worst guesses. But there are new technologies and improved techniques that are taking place today. I believe years from now, we'll know a lot more than we do today. But there will remain things that we will never be certain about. That I can assure you. And then finally, admittedly, this is my first presentation. So I thank you in advance for your patience and understanding. The origin of this presentation was inspired by Sherry Carmichael when she gave her portrayal of Irene Carpenter, wife of Nathaniel Carpenter, who traveled across New York with their family of 9 children. Oh, you're holding 2 hands up, all right. And the youngest was 19 months old?
The oldest was 19 and the youngest was a year and a half.
A year and a half old. At any rate, that was quite a trip. And they came down the Ohio River in boats to the mouth of the Scioto River, took, I believe, keel boats up the Scioto to the confluence of the Olentangy River, where there they offloaded in canoes and paddled their way up here to Liberty Township, just north of Hyatt's Road on Chapman Road today, is where the first settlement in Delaware County, and hence Liberty Township as well, was established. That is recorded in the 1880 edition of the History of Delaware County. And I'll emphasize that was recorded history, written. So I thought, what about prehistory? What about prehistoric times? What about the people that were here long before Nathaniel Carpenter and his family? So I thought I would share with you tonight since I think I know something about this, some of the things we do know about who lived here and when they came to Delaware County. We'll examine a timeline which will show us the cultures during those times, and we will drill down on 3 types of stone: flint, slate, and just stone. Mary's going to pass around 3 examples so you can get a feel for the physical nature of these raw materials and perhaps some of the technology they used. These have all been touched and worked by people thousands of years ago. After we have finished, we're welcome to come up and we can talk about these artifacts on display. Nearly all of them come from Delaware County and Liberty Township. Some I found, some my wife found, some I purchased. So I have 1 hour to cover 12,000 years. Okay, so if you could hold any questions to the end, I would appreciate it. By the way, this is a flint knife made from something we call Flint Ridge flint, and we'll talk more about that in just a little bit. I'd like to read something I got out of a book that gives us a little perspective on maybe how these prehistoric people felt and some of the things we even think about. Survival is the daily goal. How do you accomplish your goal? What do you eat? How do you stay warm when cold? What tools do you have? Where are you going next? You watch the sun rise, the clouds high in the sky, feel the rain, hear the thunder, see the lightning, see darkness fall, and the moon rise next. These mysteries must spark beliefs of the supernatural in your life. The science of archaeology cannot answer all of these questions, but it can give us a glimpse into the lives of these earliest inhabitants here in Delaware County. Science of archaeology is learning to decode the information about the once living cultures from the stuff they left behind. That's a quote from Dr. Brad Lever. Pretty easy way to define archaeology. There are 4 basic categories of evidence we can study and learn about ancient people: human remains, what bones can tell us, and quickly they can tell us how old people were when they passed. They can tell us about diet. They can tell us about how long they lived, and if they died by how they died. Features we see in form of earthworks and mounds. Ecofacts. I write midden pits, but it's really trash pits. You can tell a lot, and I'm sure someday when they're looking at our trash, they'll know a lot about us. Then we have artifacts. That's what we're going to be talking about tonight. The tools, the weapons, the ornamental and ceremonial objects that they left behind. And primarily what we're finding, because much is decomposed: wood, bone, cloth, basketry, it's gone, decomposed. We have flint, stone, and slate. Our prehistoric people. Wow, isn't that neat? When and how did they arrive here? Why did they choose Delaware County? What evidence did they leave? And how did they adapt, evolve, and survive? This is where, if you already passed, yes, so thank you. All right. So we'll talk about when and how did they arrive here. Over 25,000 years ago, North America looked like this probably. A giant ice cap. And keep in mind, North America and South America were walled off from the rest of the world. I mean, surrounded by oceans. Europe, Asia, Africa, there were people over there. There weren't any over here. somewhere after 25,000 years ago, there were apparently some melting, but the two major ice sheets were the Cordilleran and the Laurentide ice sheets. And the most well-accepted theory is when these ice or glaciers developed, they lowered the seas and created a land bridge from Asia. It was called Beringia. There's only 55 miles separating Asia from Alaska. So it allowed animals and people to come through a corridor between the ice sheets. The other theory is there was a waterway or a coastal migration. That is certainly not proven, but I can tell you there are prehistoric artifacts in Alaska. I've seen them myself in the museum up there. So we know they came across there and then down into America and eventually South America as well, and spread out to the east to Ohio. So we're in the Ice Age at this point, with people coming to the Americas. A glacier is probably, in many places, a mile thick, and it is pushing, and this is the edge of the glacier at reaching its maximum point. The blue dot is where we sit tonight. I don't know if anybody been to Kelly's Island. You've seen the glacial grooves. That's what's happened. That ice sheet shoved and pulled, and it just ground into the bedrock. Amazing force. So the maximum advance was here. These gray areas are called glacial cames or moraines, and they were where the glacier would push forward and retreat, and it would leave a small hill and piles of rocks and gravel, which actually late in the 1800s and 1900s became the source of gravel for companies, road builders, so forth. And ironically, when they first started digging into these gravel glacial cames, they found hundreds of burials, prehistoric burials. There is a culture called the glacial came culture, and that was their mortuary practice, was burying their dead in these glacial cames. Is there anything else on my notes? Well, by the way, they scooped out the Great Lakes as well. And the final thing to realize about them, as they retreated, they had brought all this soil and rock and debris down into Ohio, and they dumped it as it retreated. And keeping in mind, we only have sandstone and limestone bedrock here. We don't have granite outcroppings like they find in other states. These tools we're going to talk about that are made of stone were left by the glacier and picked up by the prehistoric people. Why come here? Delaware County, if you just imagine taking away the township borders, take away the cities, and take away the reservoirs, what do you have left? You have rivers, you have creeks, you have streams. Riverine environments were very important because that's where the wildlife flourished, and that's where the fauna or the plant life flourished. So therefore, and it would be a mode of transportation or a pathway for ancient people to use. Delaware County, I found in Wikipedia, has 27 major rivers and creeks running through it, and 437 named streams. There's a lot of water here. I think you guys, we all know the major rivers, Scioto, Olentangy, Alum, and Big Walnut. So I would think whether they're seasonal or permanent habitation sites, they were certainly located along these waterways. More reasons to come here. Flint. Flint was the predominant resource for tool making of the prehistoric people. Right here in Delaware County, we have Delaware chert. I found this example along the Olentangy River. Sandwiched between the limestone is a vein or layer or lens of Delaware chert, which was used by the Indians to create some flint tools. And then nearby we have some of the most famous flint quarries. The Coshocton or Upper Mercer mines, Zaleski, and the famous Flint Ridge quarries over in Licking County. These Flint Ridge and Upper Mercer have been found in great quantities here in Delaware County. So obviously they were transported here either pre-made, or we find chips in farm fields showing that they created them and made them right on the spot. So if we start looking at our chronology or our timeline, we start with the oldest. I'm using a dating method that's kind of religious neutral here. Instead of BC and AD, we're using BP, which is past, counting backwards into the past, before present. Paleo-Indians were the first ones to set foot here. We're going to look at a fluted point, which is their diagnostic indicator of the culture. So let's take a look at the Paleo-Indian point. These are called Clovis points. You may have heard of them. They have a unique form. These were the first people, we believe, to be here. They lived with that glacier. They followed the edge of that glacier. Why? It's because where the animals would be. The Pleistocene era animals liked cold. And there weren't a lot of forests. There was more like tundra at that point. So these were nomadic hunters that traveled in small groups, probably family, or just small clans, and hunted the animals. They used this for their spears, and what's unique, and these are found in every state in the United States. Oddly enough, it was a universally accepted tool by these people. They fluted it, which means they took this flint chip out of the base, and they always had a concave base. Oh yes, I looked for a hunting slide on Google, and I probably looked at 24 of these things, and they all had a bunch of big hairy men throwing spears, either getting trampled or I found this one, and it was different for two reasons. One is these aren't big hairy guys. These are either boys, or there could be women. I'm not sure. But this one right here in the foreground is using a weapon that none of those other pictures showed, which is probably the most important weapon during the Paleo period. I showed some carnivores. I mean, if these guys were hunters, they could also be the hunted, because those guys you don't want to meet in the woods alone. Herbivores, that's what they were hunting. Some of those were here in Delaware County. Okay, so it's time now to distinguish between a point and an arrowhead. an arrowhead is probably a misnomer for most of what we talk about tonight. Much of those over there are not arrowheads, technically speaking. The bow and arrow was probably not developed until 3,000 years ago. Of course, that is still debated today. But when you take one of these points, like the paleo points I showed you, and you think you're going to put that on an arrow and shoot it, it isn't going to go anywhere. And besides, the technology to create a bow hadn't been developed. It's not easy to build a bow. So we get to a thing called an atlatl, which is a throwing stick. And that's what primarily, between spears and atlatls, that was what this person is using. And there it is. I don't know if any of you have dogs and have ever used one of these. Put the tennis ball in it. I mean, you could throw it like this, and your arm goes with it. You can go like this and throw it, and it goes a long, long ways. Same principle. It increases the inertia, therefore the velocity. By the way, that little hook would be at the end of the atlatl, and the spear would have a little notch in it, and you could throw that spear. Instead of throwing it by hand, maybe 75 feet, and being fairly accurate, now you can throw it 150 feet and be deadly with it. It would penetrate, they believe, the hide of a mammoth or a mastodon, which you have to realize their hides would have to be very thick and difficult. But when you're hunting deer and elk and the other wildlife, these were the primary method for hunting. Again, these weren't arrowheads, they were spearheads. And that continued for thousands of years. The evidence of paleo people in Ohio, and again, we're here in Delaware County. Each little paleo point there represents an actual find. And if you think about the edge of that glacier as it retreated, you can see, I mean, these are the Appalachian Hills. They're not going to be there. But you can see that, and then you can also see where the Scioto River and the Olentangy River is. They obviously hunted a lot. I surface hunted farm fields for 25 years. I found one fluted point. That's it. And it was in the northeast corner of Franklin County, not that far from Delaware County, and it is made of Delaware chert. So, were they here? Yes. Can we prove it? This came from Concord Township in Bell Point, which is just north of Route 42. It was in a farm collection from my wife's great-grandfather, which is actually, that point is over here. This small fluted point was found on 315. There was an old dairy farm just south of the junction of Route 23. It was found along the Scioto River. And then Brent Carson's family of Delaware Historical Society donated this to them, and it is a fluted point found up by Radnor, and it is made of Delaware chert. These two are made of Coshocton flint out of Coshocton County and transported over here. When the paleo people were transitioning out of what we will call the paleo period into the Plano period, which was on the chronology, a change was occurring in their flint workmanship. you can see the difference. There's a stem base versus the concave base. That type of point making disappeared. And this began to replace it. This is a lance, a little over 4 inches long. It's 1/4 of an inch thick. It is sharp, and the tip on that thing is like a needle. It is a masterpiece of flint working. That was found along the Olentangy River by a fellow named Rick Simpson, who lived at the stone church down at the end of 315. So we saw paleo and the fluted points. We saw the transition into the plano. In the next period, the archaeologists define are the archaic, which is the longest period, 7,000 years, and it was also the end of the Ice Age. Things were changing. The climate was changing. Trees were suddenly appearing. The early archaic began using a different type of point and tools. In the middle archaic, suddenly the emergence of ground stone tools like axes and celts and pestles occurred. And then in the late archaic, new cultures were emerging, like the red ochre culture and the glacial cane, which we mentioned. So this shows you some artifacts from the archaic period. We have notched points now. This probably was a point that was reworked into a scraper. It would have been hafted on a short stick. This was hafted as well on a short stick because it was a knife, and they're made out of Flint Ridge flint, which we will go over some more in a minute. This is banded slate. This is another type of stone that came with the glacier. This is called a winged banner stone, and it's drilled through the middle. There's a 1/2 inch hole in the middle of that to be mounted on a shaft. Why? I'm not sure. Some say it's an atlatl weight, but I don't think so. There were it would take too long to make that, and it's too beautiful to risk breaking. And then the stone tool. These were ground stone tools. This is obviously an axe. It's grooved. Whoever selected this piece of rock was very selective because it has a beautiful quartz vein running through it. Many axes are in hammerstone, such things are crude, but that was a well-refined tool created by the Middle Archaic people. A few more artifacts, but the changes that were happening, people were starting to be more sedentary in the archaic period. You had a chance to live from the land, the trees dropping nuts, the berries, the river having fish and clams. So that when you start sitting in one spot, you create tools that will remain and help you with your process of inhabiting a site. This is a pestle, 5,000 or 6,000 years old. Is probably is processing food, no doubt. Handheld. This would be a knife. It was hafted, or a spear. It was found on 315, not far from the junction of 23. This was found in Africa. I don't know if anybody's ever heard of. It was over by Alum Creek, and I think it got obliterated by the reservoir. This is a birdstone, an enigmatic form of slate. It's drilled at the base. Again, it's a mystery. It's been claimed to be an atlatl weight. It's been claimed to be mounted on a shaft for ceremonial purposes or emblems, or we don't know again, but they are found in vivid banded slate colors, such as that winged banner I showed you earlier. Very much an artistic piece of work. And then finally, this was found on Mary's parents' or grandfather's farm right off of Stites Road. It's made of Indiana hornstone, which comes from southeast Indiana. It's a rare, it found its way up here somehow, and it is a wonderful example of the red ochre culture. And her cousin Mike found that when he was a young boy. Don't know why and how it got here. Many times they're in caches. I think Mike always wanted to dig a hole and see if there were more, but that is the only one he found. So now we get to the woodland culture. And again, they like the early, middle, late. This now is taking place around 3,000 years before present. And as we transition out of the archaic period, I mean, the societal structure of the people living here is changing. In 1914, William C. Mills wrote a book called the Archaeological Atlas of Ohio. He included every county in Ohio, and to the best of his knowledge and all the resources he had, he would put all known mounds and earthworks in this book. And I took the Delaware County map and basically took out Liberty Township. And in Liberty Township, we can see there are more mounds and earthworks than any other township in Delaware County. There were 9 mounds and 2 earthworks that Mr. Mills noted on here. One of them, this little hook guy down here, is, if you've ever walked back to Columbus Metro Park's high banks to the end on the lookout, there's a large earthworks back there. They say it's from the coal culture, and I'm pretty sure the coal culture is an offshoot of the Fort Ancient culture, but it's a very large earthwork. There's another one here, and I have no idea where that went. If it really exists, some of these may or may not have existed, but that's a fairly accurate representation of what was here in 1914. So from the early woodland period, we had the Adena culture. And Adena got its name from the estate of Thomas Worthington, the first governor of Ohio. He named his estate Adena. And if you've ever been there, it's up on top of a hill, and down below is like a river bottom. And this mound, which was a large mound, I believe it was like 120 feet in diameter and almost 30 feet tall, was down there. And he would never let anybody, he didn't want anybody to mess with it. But eventually the farmer wanted it's fertile ground. He wanted to farm it because it meant money. So in 1902, William C. Mills excavated the mound. He discovered there were 2 mounds in this. The original mound contained 21 burials, I believe, and then eventually they built over that, and there were 6 or 7 more burials. At the bottom of the first mound was a burial that had this, and this is called the Adena Man. It's a tubular pipe. They could have smoked one end to the other. What's curious is this guy's a dwarf, if you look at him for a second. So he must have been held in some high esteem for them to create this from pipe, carved out of pipestone. It was the state of Ohio's designated artifact. And it is one of the most famous artifacts ever discovered in Ohio, if not the. So that was the early woodland. Now we're into the middle woodland. Anybody that watched Brad Lepper, was it earlier this year, Here Speak, was a great presentation that a group of 7 sites has been designated by UNESCO as World Heritage Sites, which rank up there now with Stonehenge and the Great Pyramids. The Hopewell culture is amazing. This is the Serpent Mound. It is not one of those 7 sites yet, according to Brad. They're working hard to get it included. But he is certain it is a Hopewell site, but there are no burials in that. That is simply an earthwork, and goodness knows what it meant to them. But it's high up on a ridge, and I don't think they had balloons or airplanes to look down on it. So it is something else. This thing right here is about 11 inches long, and it is made out of obsidian, which is volcanic glass. An expert would have crafted that, a Hopewell artist, really, a lithic artist. Volcanic glass is not flint, and not to be confused with. I have a piece of obsidian up here you're welcome to look at when this is over. But they found so many exotic artifacts when they explored the Hopewell Mounds, clear back as early as 1848. That was the middle. Now the late woodland culture, there's one curious little culture here called the intrusive mound. And they had some unique artifacts that were found in association with burials, but have also been found just on the surface of farm fields. And the reason you can relate to them is because they were found with their burials. They decided to bury their dead in existing Hopewell mounds. So they came after the Hopewell people. This is an example from Squire and Davis, who wrote a book in 1848 called Ancient Monuments of the Mississippi Valley. That was Smithsonian Institute's first published book by these 2 guys. This is their drawing of one of the mounds they excavated down near Chillicothe, Mound City. There's a burial up here. The real Hopewell burials are down here. Very curious why they decided, let's just go dig a hole in the mound and stick Uncle John in there. But it's mysterious. And then on that chronology, and this is just before we move into the historic or proto-historic times, is the Fort Ancient culture. As I mentioned, the coal culture, earthworks, as you walk back to the lookout at the High Banks Park. Again, this is a drawing, I believe, by Squire and Davis of those earthworks. This was drawn many, many years before. And you can still see the earthwork back there. This guy right here is about 1.25 inches in length. It's made of Delaware chert. This is their point. You see these, it's an indicator of the Fort Ancient culture. It was probably the last stone point attached to an arrow for a bow and arrow. And I found that at the corner of Home Road and Liberty Road. In fact, I found 3 or 4 of them. They're very common points, but shortly after that, when the Europeans came and introduced them to steel, kettles, utensils, not to mention flintlock guns. These flint points disappeared, and they started using steel-tipped arrows. They even cut arrowheads out of kettles and used utensils, but there was going to be a change. One of the three stones we're talking about is flint. Ohio, this is Flint Ridge from Licking County. It is our official gemstone. Flint, it consists of silicon dioxide, or what I just say, silicone. It's a form of quartz. People ask, what's the difference between chert and flint? The difference is the amount of silica in it. The more there is, it gets classified as flint. The less it is, it becomes chert. Chert's a little more grainy. It's a little harder to chip, but it still works. Delaware chert is a great example. And it has a unique ability that when you fracture it, it's called conchoidal fracturing. And the way you take a piece of flint and whack it, and off comes a spall, and on the edge of that is like a razor blade. And they recognized suddenly they had a tool, and they could replicate this tool, and flint became predominantly the most used stone up to the point that Europeans came and brought it. So for 12,000 years, flint was the thing. It was easily shaped, strong, durable, and very sharp. Here is a cursory look at Ohio flint types. And this is a point. The base, in this case, is bifurcated, which means it has two little ears on it. Sometimes it was straight. Some have barbs. Some shoulders don't. But to form that guy, you would whack it in percussion flaking, it's called, and start reducing it. And then you would refine it with pressure flaking with a bone, like a bone antler, where you would press against the edge, and you would flake off these little flakes, and you would create a sharp edge. You hold them sideways, and some are flat, some are lenticular. The way points are made and the way they are chipped tell us what culture they're from. So it's important when you're studying this that when you, not just that, it's what cultures Hopewell chipped their points different than the archaic people. This is flint reduction, and quickly, this is the starting piece. It was probably mine. This was made by a flint knapper in modern times. But a piece like this would have been mined by the Indian, probably then brought back to their habitation site. It began its reduction through pressure flaking, which they were whacking it with a rock probably, or an antler billet, the thick end. Now we're reducing it further. Now it's becoming refined, taking shape. We're beginning to pressure flake. It's almost a knife here, and now it's a point with notches, and it's a finished product. Might have taken 30 minutes for a good napper to make that. But a mentor of mine reminded me, there are carpenters and then there are nail benders. Not everybody could do this.
I was told that they would, I found just recently a lot of blanks. We call them blanks.
Yeah.
Like the first two sets. And that you might have some, maybe the younger Indians who would take it to a certain point, and then they would move it on to somebody who had experienced, an older person who would refine those arrows. And I have a place on my property in West Virginia that I found a lot of blanks, and other people found a lot of blanks, and it might have been a production facility, if you will, at the creek.
Well, it probably was, and perhaps they were teaching they could have always been teaching their young how to produce these. But I'm going to guess that this wasn't for everybody. There were skilled artisans making these things. So here we have some examples of the 3 flint types I've been talking about. The earthy colored Delaware chert, the unbelievable colors you find in the Flint Ridge deposits up in Licking County. And then this is the black Coshocton variety. There is also a light gray variety. What's interesting though, if you look carefully, you're going to see flint types. There's a fluted point. There's a fluted point. There's a fluted point. There's a dovetail and a dovetail and a dovetail, and notched points. And so they didn't care always what source they used, but you will find flint types of the same nature in all of these different flint quarries. And then we have the gun flint. And we now are transitioning into historic times. I found this walking where Proper Garden is down at Hyatt's in 315. They were just excavating the ground. I was following a dugout ditch, and I wasn't sure, but could that be a gun flint? And sure enough, I researched it a little bit. It's an English gun flint. It was mined in England. It was mined in chalk beds. They produced them by the hundreds of thousands. And the French also had honey-colored gun flints. But for some reason, the Indians did not make their own gun flints. You put the gun flint in the hammer, strikes the steel, creates a spark, lights the powder in the flash pan. The Indians, for whatever reason, would trade for these gun flints. Why they didn't make their own. The Flint Ridge flint was certainly good enough to create a spark, but maybe not Delaware chert. But that was the beginning of the end of flint tools, stone tools, because this was a transition into the Europeans bringing brass kettles and all those things. I just thought that was an interesting little find. It's the only gun flint I ever found, by the way. I'm sure some of you have found some. Stone tools, they were left by the glacial drift. We talked about that. Granite, diorite, basalt, these other rocks, hematite. This here called porphyry. Some people called it pudding stone. They made an axe out of it. I doubt if they used that for much utility purposes. It's just too pretty. This is theoretically how a method they used, peck, grind, and polish. They'd find the rock, they'd pound on it with another rock or hammer stone, and then they would begin to form it either with sandstone or some coarse rock, and eventually they would smooth it out and even polish it. That pestle that is over here is highly polished, probably used, wetted the rock, the sandstone or sand, and polished it that way. These were from the Middle Archaic period, and evolved into the woodland as well. Some examples, as we've mentioned, the axe, the grooved axe, and that's a 3/4 groove because the bottom is flat. That's stone. Obviously, they would haft that to a shaft and pound with it, or and it might have been an axe at one time and been worked down to a hammerstone, but it's a very common tool. If you walk out in a farm field, one of the stone tools you're likely to find is a hammerstone, and they can be very crude. This would be an example. It's technically an adze, but it could be a celt. Obviously, it's ungrooved. This is probably a Hopewell artifact. These were archaic. This probably came archaic. This came from Havner Park, right up here on Liberty Road. It's called a cupstone, and nobody knows what it is. They say there's ones that have maybe 10 or 15 larger rocks have different size holes like this, or indentations. Some called them nutcrackers. They said they would hold a bow drill to start a fire, but why would you need 9 other holes in a rock? You could mash up dyes and create like hematite and make a paint, but they aren't stained. So it's just one of those we don't know's best guesses. And finally, polished stone tools. I won't dwell on this, but these are just as mysterious. This is one I found in Troy Township along the Olentangy River. They were made out of different varieties of rocks, like including slate and granite and gneiss. These are plummets, kind of named after the plumb bob of a surveyor, but they got tiny little grooves around the tops. They didn't have fishing line or real fine thread, and what would you have used that for anyway? Somebody said they were used for netting, fish nets. Nobody's going to spend hours and hours creating this and then throw it out in the river and hope it doesn't sink. So those are problematics, which again is a name for we don't know. And then finally there's slate, which it kind of speaks for itself. There are so many different forms. You could spend hours talking about the different forms of slate and how they were used. These are called flat slate, and they're probably ornamental or adornment. Single hole is a pendant, a 2-hole is a gorget. You can see banding on these, and especially see the banded slate. Again, these pieces of rock came down from the glacier in the form of a cobble or a small boulder. I found raw banded slate before, never been touched or found, but they would take that and then fashion these. This person was a true artist that created these. There's probably only a few dozen in existence. But that just gives you an idea, and then there's that birdstone again, of the different forms of slate. We found slate in Delaware County, and there's an example we'll touch on in just a moment. So finally, we're going to look at site collections. I lived, as you heard, on top of Powell Hill. Behind me and to the north, they were developing, where actually Alan Miller lives back there, the retreat development. I realized too late that you could walk out my back door into these farm fields and find artifacts. So I had about a year and a half before they developed the retreat. I went out one spring and one fall, and I found these, which tells us that This is a Hopewell point. This is an Adena point. This is an early archaic point. This may be a late archaic point, but it tells us who was running around back then and there. This is my wife's great-grandfather's collection. Her grandmother had them in cigar boxes up in the cupboard, clanking against each other. It got passed down through the family to Mary. This is from Bell Point, just north of 42, where Mill Creek runs into the Scioto River. And he had a farm there. And these are really undamaged, pretty pristine, which was the result of early farming. You didn't have giant tractors with gigantic plows. See that guy? You recognize that? Right in the middle. That's a paleo fluted point. Somebody 12,000 years ago was running around and hunting around Bell Point in Delaware County. We pretty much have every other culture here, from the early archaic through the woodland, through the, I don't see a Fort Ancient point. Curiously, that brown piece, this blade, is made of Carter Cave flint, which comes from Kentucky, Carter County, Kentucky, across from Portsmouth. It made its way up here. These are stone celts, and they were found also by her great-grandfather, Hosea Taylor. And finally, the one I like the most for a farm collection is the Case Farm Collection. I can't remember the year you called me, Mary, but our family knew pre-kids. Okay, so it was before 1982. We were friends with Lula and Jane Case, who lived in that. Has anybody ever sat and waited for the light to change at Powell Road, at Jewett Road and 315? Yeah, and you look over and there's that black barn and that beautiful house. That farm was an 86-acre farm owned by Peter Case, who married Anna Mulzer back somewhere in 1906 or something. Yeah, and so Mary calls me up on the phone and says, Lula and Jane, who's her sister, are going to move and sell the house, but they brought this box out of the closet and said, maybe your husband would be interested in this. That's the box. When Lula was in elementary school, she painted that box. So that would be 1920 something. And in there was this stuff. And so I got over there and I negotiated it and we made a deal. That's my favorite collection. It tells us a lot about that corner of 315 and Jewett Road. Who was here? That is a archaic bevel. It probably used to be twice as long, and they sharpened it by beveling it. You can tell by the size of the base that it would have been a larger point. But when they resharpened it, and curiously, they always strive to keep those barbs intact. But it is a pristine little example of archaic bevel. And even though it's a very common point, it's very difficult to find unbroken ones. This is about a 4-inch side-notched point. I believe it's archaic. But you hold it up to the light and it's translucent. A knife. We have intrusive mound point here. We don't have a paleo point, but we have a lot of archaic and some woodland points. We have a piece of slate, which is curiously was broken, and they used these holes to half to the other half. We don't have the other half. And sometimes they did that. We have a stone celt, a slate celt, which is probably Hopewell. We have a Adena point, early woodland, and some knives. So it was, and then there was a slate pendant also in the box. And she kept a stone pestle in a flower pot with a little kind of, what was a butterfly glued to it? And she gave me that too. So, but it was just a really neat and representative collection, and it tells us, that's why I love farm collections. They tell us what was in a certain location and that was picked up, and I hope that can remain intact, because once you break these apart and you sell them off, the story is lost, and provenance is lost, and you don't want that to happen. So that's it. Resource credits, these are some of the books I used and pictures from this. They're all available out there if anybody's interested. And the Archaeological Society of Ohio has a set as well. So thank you. And I always say, if you're out walking in a field, keep your eyes open. That's my wife. And these are some of the things we found laying in the dirt.
Got 2 fields.
Hey,
Fields on the
Steve,
farm now. I got
Yes.
out there.
I think you should tell everyone that you are published and where they can read your
Oh, yeah, your articles. in the
Well,
archaeology.
I've written some articles in the Archaeological Journal for the Archaeological Society of Ohio that she's referring to. So I know, I think Randy has. That's what we love about this hobby of ours. You meet people, you share, and there's a lot of people that are interested in it. So, any questions, Tim?
We talk about mining flint. Is it like a vein of flint, or is there larger rocks that they cut into smaller rocks, or how's that?
Well, it'll vary by flint type, but when you get over to Flint Ridge, has anybody been to the Flint Ridge State Park? Okay. There are hundreds of flint pits where they mined. It's down. The flint you find on the surface has been weathered and it doesn't shatter. It doesn't work well. They've actually built a museum over one of the flint pits at Flint Ridge, and you can go and see how they did it. But they would take out big pieces of flint and then break those down, and then take those and transport them many times back to where they lived, and then reduce it as we showed. Others are in vein, like that Delaware shirt example. You would have to break off a piece of limestone with it running through it and then extract the flint. Coshocton flint was coming out in the banks of rivers and creeks. It is also in layers, so they could just break it out of there. But it differs. Okay? Yes.
One of the amazing things about Flint Ridge, or at least I saw, was you looked at these pits, and I told my daughter, it's like, look down in there, and there's somewhere between 3,000 and 15,000 years worth of leaves and branches and crap that's fallen in it, and it's still, you can see 4 feet down. So, and they're just hundreds of pits through that area.
Those deposits were mined for 12,000 years at least, as well as the Coshocton Upper Mercer deposits. In fact, the Coshocton deposits were probably more used than even the Flint Ridge for whatever reason. But you can drive along the roads up by Warsaw and in Coshocton, and alongside the road, it's like gravel in some places. Just pieces of Coshocton flint. It was so abundant. Any other questions? You're welcome to stop up and look at the artifacts, and if they generate any questions, I'm happy to answer.